Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me. Whenever I speak to a crowd about what's been going on in the economy and the markets, I always have to figure out what I'm going to leave out and what I'm not going to talk about. When I first started doing these sort of chats, it was how can I fill 45 minutes? It's impossible. And now it's how can I cut this down to 45 minutes? So we'll start now and we'll end around Tuesday, but we'll take breaks out, for bathroom and eating occasionally. So what we'll do is I'll speak about some highlights from the book and some other relevant things, and then we'll open it up for questions. We'll open up for Q&A, and we'll go from there. I'm not going to do just a traditional reading because no one wants to hear my nasal twang reading for a half hour. So instead, I'm going to give you a few highlights and a few of the more interesting favored sectors that are relevant to what's going on in the news this week. A lot of this stuff continues to be front page headlines, and so hopefully you'll find this stuff somewhat interesting. So let's start with 10 things you probably didn't know about the bailouts. I was at a dinner about 3 months ago, and I was by far the biggest piker in the room. Everybody else was, this guy worked for the city of New York, and that guy was a senior person at Goldman Sachs, and this person was at the Federal Reserve. And the book still was being edited and finished up. And the conversation was, how do we pull ourselves out of this collapse? How do we get out of this horrific morass? And what really struck me that I heard over and over again was people did not understand how this came to pass. And it was very much an example. There's an old Rudyard Kipling story about the 6 blind men describing an elephant. And one of the blind guys has the tail, and the other one has an ear, a tusk, a leg, a trunk, and they're all describing a different aspect, and no one sees the whole. So part of the goal of the book was to really give a big overview and show everything that's happening in a way that makes some sense. So the first false statement that's out there, the first major misunderstanding is this was an accident. This was a perfect storm. It was completely random. 1 in a million shot will never happen again. And I got some bad news for you. It was no such thing. Nobody wanted this to happen, but there were a series of decisions made by corporate executives, by bankers, by government regulators, by other actors in the financial sector that pretty much, it wasn't that this was a 1 in a million shot. This was inevitable. This was unavoidable given a lot of the policies and the behaviors that were in place over the past 10, 15 years. And we'll go over a few of those in a little bit. The second thing I heard that really made my hair stand on end was, when we finish putting all this money into these companies, we're going to make a profit on this. That is just one of the more astonishing misstatements. And, we're all used to being sold stuff by TV salesmen and people on the phone, but it has to at least be credible. You have to at least believe that Shamu will hold 40 times its weight in water. If you don't buy that basic premise, you're not even going to think about it, or it has to be entertaining. The line that they were selling, it was neither entertaining nor realistic. The reality is, if you take the inflation-adjusted costs of the special one-time expenditures of the U.S., go back to the Louisiana Purchase, go back to World War I and II, look at the full list, the Korean War, the S&L crisis, the race to the moon, the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe and rebuilding Japan. Combine all that stuff together, and it still doesn't add up to the total amount of money we've committed over the past 12 months. Now, the difference that those 206 years worth of expenditures are versus the past 12 months is that money was spent and we'll never see it back. In terms of the $14.5 trillion that we've spent, guaranteed loans, promised, or somehow assumed responsibility for, the expectation is that we'll get 85, 90, 95% of that back. In order to get a profit, it would have to be 100+%. That's highly unlikely. The problem when you're dealing with really big numbers is 10% of 14 trillion is still $1.4 trillion. Let me step back and talk a little bit about numbers. I know people hate when you talk about billions and millions and trillions and everybody's eyes glaze over, but let me just give you a couple of ways to think about these numbers. Before the recession started, in an average year, the U.S. economy as a whole was about $14 trillion. That's a big number. Biggest economy in the world, one-fourth the entire global economy, $14 trillion. In any given year, the U.S. government is $3.5 trillion. So when you're talking about bailouts of $14 trillion, it's the whole output of everybody in the country for one full year. So that's a pretty big number. And again, all of that isn't gone, but I got to think there are other things that we could be doing with that money. And then I got a really interesting question from someone when I was writing the book, and they said, you know, what is a trillion? I really don't understand a trillion. Because when we talk about millions, you can conceptualize it. Hey, the guy's house down the block is $1 million. And when you talk about a billion, it's a big money. It's a big number. It's a big amount of money. It's Steve Jobs' money. It's Larry Ellison or Bill Gates' money. But you can roughly grasp it. When you start talking about a trillion, it's hard to conceptualize. Most people don't know what $1 trillion is. So let me give you the best. And I scratched my head and tried to figure out a way to convey it. And the best way I came up with was this. If you live the average lifespan in the United States, you'll live to be 72 years old. That's the average, although it's moving higher. But let's work with that number. At 72 years old, you will be 2 billion seconds. 2 billion with a B. If you wanted to live to be 1 trillion seconds old, you would have to live to be 31,500 years and change. So the difference between a billion and a trillion is a lot, and the difference between spending $1 billion and spending $1 trillion is a whole lot. And when we're talking about $14.5 trillion in a $14 trillion economy where the government is about 3 and change trillion, these are really, really big numbers. The joke that someone had said previously was, you know, we used to call these astronomical numbers because they were the differences and distances between stars, but now we're going to have to start calling them economic numbers because that's how much money we're actually spending. You know, no one's really at fault for this. The CEOs were really acting on behalf of the shareholders. I've been reading, although not as much lately. The 15 CEOs of the biggest companies involved in this took home a collective $1.5 billion in salary and bonuses. Now, these, again, aren't the Steve Jobs of the world who are inventing things and their company stock prices are going from 3 to 150. These are the guys who are destroying their companies and basically taking a lot of money for doing so. So Angelo Mazzillo at Countrywide, $400 million. Stan O'Neill at Merrill Lynch, $160 million. Dick Fuld of Lehman for turning down a number of offers of capital and essentially condemning his company to death, pocketed about $500 million in stock over the previous couple of years. Again, we're not talking about people who are just a little wealthy, who did a great job. Someone asked me the other day, what do you think about this guy out in Stony Brook? Runs Renaissance Technologies, Jim Simon. He's paying himself $3 billion a year. Is he losing money? Is he destroying companies? No, he's making 40% a year for his investors for the past 30 years. Hey, that guy can pay himself whatever the hell he wants. You know, if you're making money and not destroying the economy, it's between him and his clients. But if you are supposedly running a company for the benefit of your shareholders and are doing a really bad job of it, I have a hard time rationalizing not just tens of millions of dollars, but hundreds of millions of dollars. Stop and think about 30, 40 years ago, the ratio between the lowest paid employee and the CEO was 35 to 1. It's now skyrocketed up to over 300 to 1. And it was heading up to 400 to 1 before all this happened. So since I mentioned Dick Fuld, let's talk about Dick Fuld of Lehman Brothers. One of the talking points we keep hearing is it was a terrible mistake for the Federal Reserve to let Lehman Brothers die, right? Remember what happened in March 2008? Bear Stearns had collapsed. They were somewhat rescued. We gave $29 billion to JP Morgan to buy them. I haven't quite figured out why yet. No one has really given me a good explanation other than the fact that JP Morgan had about $4 trillion with a T dollars of derivative exposure from Bear Stearns. But if that's the case, it was up to them to buy it.